Hello.
It was a Friday afternoon, right before the weekend, and I happened to be driving right past the building where my wife works. On a whim, I figured I'd just swing on in. No heads up, no calling her ahead of time, just a total surprise to take her out for a bite to eat. See, we used to do stuff like that all the time when we were younger, but over the last few years it just kind of fizzled out. Between the grind of our jobs, being exhausted, and just the general craziness of life, we got out of the habit. But right then, a random window of free time opened up in my schedule out of nowhere, and I thought, man, why the heck not? When I walked into the lobby, there was this young girl working the front reception desk who I'd never laid eyes on before. I asked for my wife, and she goes, "Vanessa?" Oh, she actually stepped out for lunch with Mr. Cullen. And then, right on the heels of that, she tacks on, "As usual." That made me pause. As usual? I asked. The kid froze, realizing she'd said too much, and tried to backpedal real quick. Oh, I just mean Mr. Cullen takes the whole staff out to eat a lot. It's probably just a work thing. She spit those words out way too fast. But honestly, in that exact moment, it didn't even register with me. Look, in 17 years of being happily married, the thought of checking up on my wife had literally never crossed my mind. I'm just not that kind of guy. I don't track her phone location, I don't snoop through her text messages, and I sure as heck don't interrogate her at the front door if she gets home a little late. My philosophy has always been that if you've slept next to someone for nearly 2 decades, you either trust them completely, or what are you even doing in the relationship? Besides, I knew Cullen was a massive client for her firm. Rich guy, big-time investor, something along those lines. So it made perfect sense that they'd be grabbing a bite to talk shop. The receptionist probably just used a poor choice of words, right? I went ahead and asked her which restaurant they went to, and she told me they were at the Capitol Grill over on Main Street. It was only a few blocks away, and as I started walking down toward the parking lot, I was already half laughing at myself for being silly. In my head, I was picturing the whole scene playing out. I'd walk right up to their table, shake Cullen's hand, and Vanessa would spend the rest of the week teasing me about playing detective. I hopped into my truck and drove on over there, completely convinced that in 30 minutes, the two of us would be having a good chuckle about the whole thing. For about the first 10 seconds after I stepped inside the restaurant, it actually felt like that's exactly how it was going to go down. But then I caught sight of her. It was a little after 1 p.m. when I walked through the doors, and the main dining room was only about half full since the heavy lunch rush had already cleared out. The host at the front gave me a look like he was about to ask if I needed a table, but I just waved him off, scanning the room for my party. I started walking deeper into the restaurant, looking across the tables, and that's when I spotted her. Vanessa was sitting all the way against the far wall with her back turned toward me. Sitting right across from her was a heavy-set guy in his 50s wearing a gray jacket, and the two of them were leaning in, talking in really low voices. My first instinct was to just walk straight over to say hello. But right then, I noticed one specific detail. Her hand was resting right on top of his. And completely on autopilot, she was slowly, gently running her finger right across his knuckles. I stopped dead in my tracks. Right at that moment, Cullen said something to her, and she let out this quiet, intimate little laugh. Every fiber of my being wanted to march over there, but I could already hear her voice echoing inside my head, saying, "You're reading this all wrong, Russ. He's just a business contact. You've completely lost your mind." And you know what? An hour earlier, I would have told myself the exact same thing. But I wasn't about to stand there in the middle of a crowded restaurant looking like a jealous idiot. Before I did anything, I needed to actually understand what I was looking at. I took a step back, ducking behind a large column right by the entrance of the dining room. I pulled out my phone, snapped 2 quick photos of them, and then I turned right around and walked out the door. What would you do in this situation? Would you have confronted them right then and there, or would you have walked away to gather your thoughts like I did? Once I got out to the parking lot, I just sat there in the cab of my truck with both hands gripping the steering wheel. I honestly have no clue how long I stayed parked there. Only one single image kept looping through my mind over and over again. Her hand. the exact way her finger trailed across his knuckles. Look, you can try to rationalize a lot of things, but that is simply not how a person sits through a professional business lunch. I realized I had about 4 hours to kill before she was due to get back home. And for the very first time in 17 years of marriage, I had absolutely no idea how I was supposed to look my wife in the eye. I finally turned the key, started up the truck, and made the drive back to an empty house. Sitting there alone in the quiet, my mind started racing, and I began remembering things. I wasn't just thinking about random nights out, either. One specific memory kept pushing its way to the front of my brain. Cast your mind back to last fall. Vanessa had this big company event, and I went along as her date. At some point during the night, she took me by the arm and walked me over to this big, gray-haired fellow. She introduced him, saying, "This is Mr. Cullen, our key client, and this is Russ, my husband." The guy gave me a firm, macho handshake, told me Vanessa was the absolute best asset they had at the firm, and told me I was a lucky man. I remember feeling so proud in that moment, just standing there nodding along. But now, a different part of that evening came flooding back. During that entire party, she barely ever left his table. Back then, I just chalked it up to work, figuring she was just doing her job and keeping an important client happy. I even remember walking up to them at one point, and the second I approached, they both went completely silent. I assumed they were discussing confidential business, so I just turned around and headed over to the bar to give them space. At the time, none of those little details meant a damn thing. But sitting in my truck, they suddenly meant everything. The floodgates opened, and the memories just kept piling up, one after another. Take her birthdays and holidays, for instance. She always seemed to find some excuse to swing by the office for an hour or so. And the kicker? I was the one who drove her over there myself. I literally delivered her right to him. Then there was that expensive bracelet she came home with back in March. She told me she bought it for herself using her bonus money, and I remember being genuinely thrilled for her. And what about that new client out in Dallas? The trip where she had to stay at a hotel for 2 whole nights? Now, I had a pretty damn good idea of who that client actually was. But you want to know the absolute worst part about all of this? She wasn't even trying to hide it from me. She didn't have to, because I was the one doing all the heavy lifting for her, constantly explaining away every single red flag. Oh, it's just a client. It's just work. He's a very important guy. If you take any one of those incidents by themselves, they don't look like much. They're nothing. But I had never lined them all up next to each other because I had absolutely no reason not to trust her. But now they were all lined up in a perfect, damning row. And that girl at the reception desk today, the way she said "as usual" so calmly, just in passing, it wasn't spoken like it was some dirty little secret. It was spoken like it was common knowledge that the entire office already knew about. That is the part that truly tears me up inside. Her coworkers knew. The very same people who smiled and shook my hand at that company event. Every single one of them knew the truth, while I was completely in the dark. To all of them, I was just the chump, the clueless husband who didn't have a faint clue what was going on. All right, then. If they were all used to me being convenient, quiet, and blind, I figured I'd let them keep thinking that way for just a little bit longer. In about 2 hours, Vanessa was going to walk through that front door, plant a kiss on my cheek, and ask me how my day went. And for the first time in 17 years, there was going to be exactly one person in this house who knew a hell of a lot more than he was letting on. And that person was going to be me. I needed time to process this, and for the moment, the clock was actually working in my favor. Right on schedule, 2 hours later, Vanessa walked through the door. She came over and kissed me. She sighed and said, "Ugh, dealing with tired clients all day." I didn't say a word back. Needless to say, I didn't sleep a single wink that night. I knew I needed something undeniable, something solid I could hold in my hands. The next morning, while she was still sound asleep in our bed, I quietly opened up our shared rideshare app on my phone. It's a single account that we both used together. I scrolled through and pulled up her entire trip history from that business trip to Dallas. The paper trail was clear as day. A straight, clean shot from the airport directly to the Ritz-Carlton. "I got you covered," Here is the entire story reworked into the voice of a regular American guy telling his tale first person, fully polished for an AI voiceover, and with a natural listener engagement moment right where the tension peaks. She didn't get picked up until 11:15 that night. The last time she'd even been out that way was a couple of weeks back. I just sat there staring at my phone, desperately trying to cook up some kind of normal explanation for it all. Maybe it was just a late dinner with a client, or they'd booked a conference room for some late-night meetings because the schedule got moved around. I was willing to believe anything. But then I remembered that bracelet. She'd told me she almost lost it at the hotel during her last trip to Dallas, claiming she spent half the evening tearing her room apart looking for it. So, I looked up the number for the Ritz-Carlton in Dallas and dialed. When the front desk answered, I played it cool. "Hi there. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Cullen's assistant. He stayed with you guys about 2 weeks ago. A Mrs. Hargrove was with him, Vanessa Hargrove. She left a bracelet in the room, and Mr. Cullen asked me to ring you up and see if housekeeping turned it up." I could hear the sound of keyboard keys clicking on the other end. "Just one moment, sir. Let me check the system for you," the voice said. And that's when I heard the exact words I'd been dreading. "I see the reservation you're talking about right here, sir. But unfortunately, no bracelet was logged into our lost and found for those dates. Tell you what, I can reach out to the housekeeping supervisor again and give you a call back later today." "No need for all that," I told her. "I'll just let Mr. Cullen know. Appreciate your help." I hung up the phone, set it down on the counter, and walked out the back door into the night air. There wasn't a single doubt left in my mind. By Saturday afternoon, I was parked in front of my laptop, digging into this Cullen guy. Turned out he was a 55-year-old managing partner for an investment fund up in Chicago. I found his bio on the company site, photos of him speaking at conferences, and even a business magazine interview from 2 years ago. The guy had been married for 28 years to a woman named Margaret Cullen, who was the chairperson for a massive charity foundation in Chicago. Her face was all over the internet for her city philanthropy work. They had a daughter who was a junior at Stanford, and I found a picture of Margaret and her daughter at graduation, totally smiling and arm in arm. 28 years of marriage to a woman who probably had absolutely no clue where her husband was spending his free time. Next, I pulled up the website for the firm where Vanessa worked and clicked on the team page. There was her headshot and her bio. Senior Wealth Advisor, specializing in managing portfolios for high-net-worth clients. And right there at the bottom, listed as the firm's top client, was Cullen. Her entire career was built on this one guy and his money. All those years she spent climbing the corporate ladder, the big promotions, that fat bonus back in March, and the Dallas trip, it was all because of him. This wasn't just some messy affair with a client. Her entire livelihood was riding on it. If her firm ever caught wind that she was sleeping with a client, she'd be thrown out on her ear the exact same day. No severance package, no references, nothing. They write that strictly into the very first page of the employment contract. I leaned back in my office chair and looked at the board. I had 3 cards sitting on the table. Margaret, who was completely in the dark, his big reputation up in Chicago, and Vanessa's high-paying seat at her firm. Now it was just a matter of figuring out which card to play first. On Monday, I started doing my homework on Margaret Cullen. I opened up Google, and within an hour, I had her whole life mapped out. She was the face of that charitable foundation, constantly featured in magazines, giving speeches on YouTube, and posing at art gallery openings. And in every other photo, she was either with her daughter, her dogs, or standing right next to Cullen. Then I spotted an announcement on the foundation's homepage. This coming Saturday at 9 a.m., they were hosting their quarterly donor breakfast at the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago, and Margaret was scheduled to give the opening remarks. It was an exclusive deal for major donors with a $5,000 entry fee. I didn't hesitate. I registered, paid the fee, and booked a Friday night flight to Chicago. On top of that, I hired a private investigator down in Dallas. I kept it brief. Gave him the dates of her last 2 trips to the Ritz-Carlton, her flight info, and hotel details. I told him I wanted everything he could dig up on this guy and those specific dates. By Thursday evening, a courier dropped a thick envelope at my door. Inside were 42 crystal-clear photographs. There was Vanessa and Cullen hanging out in the lobby, his hand resting on her waist. There they were in the restaurant, kissing right across the dinner table. Another one by the elevator, with him whispering something in her ear while she laughed. And then the morning shots in the parking lot, showing her getting into his car. On the back of every single photo, the PI had stamped the exact date, time, and location. My little folder for Margaret was locked and loaded. That night, Vanessa casually asked me what my plans were for the weekend. I just told her I had a quick one-night work trip up in Chicago. She just nodded and walked into the bedroom. I hit the road for the airport at 7 a.m., and by 8:45 Saturday morning, I was standing right there in the lobby of the Drake Hotel. I was wearing a sharp suit, a dark shirt, and no tie, holding a thick manila folder stuffed with those 42 photos. The breakfast was up on the second floor. The room was beautiful, round tables, white tablecloths, about 200 people milling around, sipping coffee, eating pastries, and talking quietly about big money. I grabbed my name tag at the registration desk, walked inside, and took a seat at a table way off to the side. Right at 9 a.m., Margaret stepped up to the microphone. She was wearing a dark blue dress, a strand of pearls, and had short gray hair. She spoke for about 8 minutes, thanking the donors, talking up a new program for children's hospitals, and asking everyone to dig deep this year. Her voice was steady and calm, clearly used to speaking to big crowds. When she stepped down from the podium, a small group of people immediately crowded around her. I stayed put and waited my turn. Once the last person walked away, I stood up and made my move. "Mrs. Cullen," I said. She turned around and gave me a polite, professional smile. My badge simply read, Russell Hargrove, Texas. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" I didn't say a word. I just set the folder down on the table right next to her coffee cup. She picked it up, slid out the first couple of photos, and completely froze. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just stared at that top picture for a few long seconds. Then, she quietly slid them back in and closed the folder. I looked at her and said, "I figured you'd want to know the absolute truth before this whole thing lands in the hands of lawyers and the newspapers." Then I turned around and walked straight out the door. "Now, let me ask you straight up. What would you do if you were in my shoes at that exact moment? Would you have dropped the photos or handled it differently?" By 1 p.m., I was already on a flight heading back home to Fort Worth. I pulled into the driveway around evening, and I noticed Vanessa's car was parked outside. The light in the home office was turned on, and that's where I found her. She looked completely pale and shaken up. She slammed her phone down on the desk, looked at me, and said Cullen had just blocked her number on everything. On top of that, her boss had received a formal letter from Cullen's attorney that morning, claiming Vanessa was trying to blackmail him and extort him for money. Obviously a move by Cullen to cover his own backside with his wife. She stared me dead in the eye, furious, and demanded, "Russ, what the hell did you do?" I didn't blink. I calmly told her that her little secret rendezvous with Cullen weren't a secret anymore. I told her I was just up in Chicago yesterday and had a little chat with his wife. Vanessa looked like she'd been hit by a train. I added, "Cullen did exactly what any guy with that kind of money does. He protected his wife, his fortune, and his foundation, and he threw you under the bus." Vanessa dropped into her chair without saying a single word, just staring blankly at the wall. She was trying to process this ruthless move from the powerhouse client she'd built her entire 7-year career on. The conversation was over. I turned around, walked into the other room, and left her alone to stew in reality. By Monday evening, the hammer dropped. Vanessa got a phone call from her firm's internal security compliance office, and she picked it up right there in front of me. The voice on the speaker was pure ice. The guy stated her full name, her corporate title, and her employee ID number. He told her that her access to all company systems had already been completely cut off, and she had exactly 1 hour to hand over her corporate laptop and her security badge. She was being fired for cause due to a gross violation of her employment contract, meaning no severance pay and 0 professional references. And just like that, the line went dead. The entire house went dead silent. Vanessa just stood there in the middle of the kitchen, holding her phone, staring at the blank screen like she expected some kind of miracle message to pop up. 7 years of hard work, her golden goose client, the massive bonuses, the luxury trips, all erased with a single phone call. She finally set the phone down on the kitchen island and looked up at me. "You did this. You destroyed all of it." I didn't say a word. There was absolutely nothing left to explain to her. She stood there for another second, turned on her heel and walked upstairs. Her time at the firm was officially history. 2 days later, I walked into the kitchen first thing in the morning. Vanessa was sitting at the table, clutching a mug of coffee. I walked over, opened up a folder, and laid the paperwork right down in front of her. Divorce papers with standard, clean-cut terms for dividing up our assets. She looked down at the front page, then looked up at me. I kept my voice completely level. "This marriage is over, Vanessa. Dragging this out in court isn't going to do either of us any favors. The house was mine before we got married, so it stays mine. Your car and your bank accounts stay yours." She read through the pages in total silence. I just stood by the window, looking out, giving her all the time she needed without rushing her. She didn't fight me, and she didn't try to negotiate. She just picked up a pen and signed her name on every single line where it was flagged. I took the papers back, tucked them into the folder, and drove straight over to my lawyer's office. The legal stuff wrapped up in just a few days. The marriage was officially dissolved, and we both went our separate ways to start over. I never heard another word from Cullen directly, but a couple of months down the road, a tiny blurb popped up in the business section of the paper. It mentioned he was stepping down from his role at the charitable foundation due to private family matters. As for Vanessa, she packed up her things and moved out by the end of that week. Where'd she go? I never bothered to ask. A month later, a mutual buddy mentioned through the grapevine that she'd moved back into her mom's place down in Houston. Turns out nobody in Fort Worth would touch her with a 10-foot pole. In that line of work, everyone talks and reputation is everything. You look at Vanessa, and she lost absolutely everything in a split second. Her career, her money, her status, her marriage. And yeah, on paper, I'm the one who pulled the trigger because I delivered those photos. But on the other hand, she's the one who built her entire life like a house of cards, lying to everyone around her. So here's a question for you guys to chew on. Do you think what happened to her was just my personal revenge? Or was it simply karma catching up to someone who thought they could outrun it? Let me know in the comments. Monday morning, I got right back to running my business, and life kept on moving forward. Appreciate you guys listening. Hit that like button, make sure to subscribe, and stick around because I've got plenty more untold stories coming your way soon.
Bye-bye.